Hello and welcome back to another episode of Insights. I'm Samuel McVicker. I am the podcast producer here at Sibylline, and I'm joined today by Megan Sutcliffe, Principal Analyst for the Middle East and Africa, and James Barrett, Associate Analyst on the Threat Intelligence Unit desk. We're here to talk about what's been going on around the world regarding these Gen Z protests. Mr. James has just written an amazing report looking at all of them from Peru, Morocco to Nepal, which was back in September. And then we are going to speak to Megan about the latest big one, which was Madagascar, which has now resulted in regime change. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to start with Nepal. Just as a quick recap, James, it was a while back, but if folks weren't really paying attention, what exactly sparked the protests? What exactly happened there?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, on the 8th of September, we saw protests begin in Nepal, and they were mainly concentrated in the capital of Kathmandu. Now, for context, there's been widening anti-government discourse visible in Nepal for some time now, and this usually focuses on issues of corruption, unemployment, and poor governance. Now, the prevalent anti-government sentiment was really illustrated earlier this year during a movement that has been termed the Nepo Kids movement. And this was a social media-based trend which emerged, scrutinising the lavish and luxurious lifestyles of politicians and their families, and specifically their children, with the masses of Nepal who were facing mass unemployment and economic hardships as well. Now, arguably, the specific trigger for the protests we saw starting on the 8th of September was a proposed ban by the Nepalese government on several social media platforms. And it was really in response to this, and underpinned by the aforementioned anti-government sentiments that have existed in Nepal for some time, that we saw the initial protests occurring on the 8th. So what's really interesting here is that, as you've alluded to, we saw Gen Z demographics engaging really quite extensively in these protests. I'll come on to a little bit later some of the tactics that they used, but that's a little bit of context around what's been happening in Nepal, the sort of magnitude and scale of it, and why it's really important to analyse.
Cool. So you mentioned there the Nepo kids, kind of the upper crust of society, and then this proposed social media ban kind of merging into one to create this anger and this hostility. Now, I saw in your report there's some demographic play at work here. There's a lot of young folks in Nepal. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's roughly about 56% of the Nepalese population that are aged 30 or below. So a really significant portion. And I think this is what gave rise to the large-scale protests that we saw. Not only did this percentage of the population feel disproportionately targeted by the proposed social media ban, you know, these people are reliant on social media for connectivity, for communication, for work in some cases, for social discourse. But I think it's the fact that they constitute such a large percentage of the Nepalese population that led to these Gen Z protests becoming so destructive and so effective in their outlook as well.
So I want to compare some of this to other sort of young people protests that we've seen in the past, but I'm going to save that for when we bring Megan in. What I've been really curious about is this Jolly Roger flag. Can you tell me anything about that? It's a fun piece of this.
Yes, it's a really interesting trend that we've seen in Nepal. For a little bit of context, there's this flag. It's a Jolly Roger flag that has been taken from a Japanese TV show called One Piece. And in this TV show One Piece, you have the sort of hero character who is a pirate who is fighting against an autocratic and largely corrupt world government in order to become the king of pirates. And we saw this flag adopted by activists in Nepal, we think, because not only did it indicate sort of government, anti-government sentiments rather, and this feeling of discontentment with the political system, but it did it in quite a covert and clandestine way, which meant that an activist could hold up a banner at the protest, and other people from Gen Z who have the same kind of cultural references would understand what it meant without this activist necessarily becoming a target of sort of police responses to protests. I think beyond this, though, what's really interesting is this Jolly Roger flag isn't exclusive to Nepal. we've seen this flag used in a lot of other countries that are experiencing Gen Z unrest at the moment. That includes France, Indonesia, the Philippines, Ecuador, Peru, and Madagascar, as Megan will talk on later. And what we think is that this flag really indicates amongst Gen Z groups a feeling of sort of disenfranchisement, a feeling that they have no place within society, a feeling that they're searching for community outside of a sort of centralized protest or activist group that has a core identity. Yeah, absolutely agree with you. It's a really interesting trend, something that we'll definitely be keeping an eye on, and something that we've seen spread beyond Nepal as well, which has been quite a development.
Yeah, that's cool. And what an amazing icon to pick for your movement. Okay, so then the big kind of catchy news was the prime minister resigns. There is a Discord call, and they select a new one. Can you just talk us through that very briefly? What exactly happened? Where are we at now in Nepal?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the Prime Minister at the time was a gentleman called KP Sharma Oli. He resigned on the 9th of September, so on the second day of protests. And I think this was a really major development because we haven't seen sort of governmental change spurred on by the people and by activism in Nepal really since the end of the civil war in 2006. And I think it underscores the magnitude of the protests and also the belief within government that their position was untenable and they had to be responsive to the masses and had to almost bow to the power of the people, so to say. But I think it also underscores the kind of increasing approach the government is taking to potentially trying to prioritise democratic reform. The fact that the interim Prime Minister, Shashila Karki, was selected on a list that was generated on the Discord gaming platform that was then handed over to the government really indicates that there is a trend towards the Nepalese government and the new regime looking to listen to the people rather than crack down on dissent as they try to before with the social media ban.
Thank you very much, James. Let's quickly go through Peru here. Now, I didn't see anything in the news about Peru compared to Nepal. So can you just take us through why did this one start?
Yeah, absolutely. So briefly, a little bit of context. There's been, again, long-standing political discontent in Peru, mostly aimed at the president, Dina Boluarte. She has had pretty negative approval ratings for several months now. We're talking in the single figures, which really indicates kind of the level of discontent that's been felt. And it usually centres around issues of crime, again, corruption, poor governance, in this case, as well, pension reform. So what we saw in sort of mid-September when these protests were taking place and started was a whole host of Gen Z activists from different kind of ideological movements and different sort of specific issue-based movements coming together to sort of march against the government in large-scale protests and demonstrations to vie for change. And in short, similar to Nepal, although we can't completely attribute it to the Gen Z protests, we did see the President Dina Boluarte impeached on the 10th of October, which indicates again the kind of magnitude of these protests and really the knock-on effects they can have in terms of government decision-making.
Okay, so this might be a weird question, but how much would you say they are linked, the Nepal and Peru protests in the broader scope?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I think what we certainly are seeing is a trend towards Gen Z activism, and there are certainly similarities between that activism. I think it's usually underpinned by an anti-government mandate, and similar to Nepal, we did see the use of the Jolly Roger flag in Peru as well. So there are certainly similarities in the kind of iconographic sense too. But I think it's impossible necessarily to link those events specifically. There's an argument there that seeing the efficacy of the protests in Nepal might have spurred protesters on in Peru and in other nations because they've seen that actually this type of activism can lead to change, and indeed it has done in Peru. But it's a difficult one to quantify in terms of were they actually linked, or is it more just a global trend that is evolving as a result of increased social media, increased activism amongst young people, and increased engagement with social and political discourse.
Okay, let's bring in Megan, but before we do, James, I just want to do a quick plug. We're going to talk about your paper a little bit more from your desk. Can you just take me through how many protests around the world does your paper cover? And what was the sort of thesis of the paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So so the Activism Monthly Review is something that we in the Threat Intelligence Unit publish each month. Generally, what we do is cover 2 emerging activist groups and then 2 or 3 emerging activist trends. And we break these down, look at the tactics, the procedures of these groups, look at a strategic forecast. Where do we think they're going to go in the future? What do we think this means for individual companies and businesses? But we also do this with trends, which is what we covered this month in the monthly review with the Gen Z protest. So it's a really interesting, quite holistic report that seeks to sort of forecast and understand what the current threat landscape that is posed by activism looks like, and apply that to businesses and to public figures and government as well. So without the risk of being called biased, I would definitely recommend a read. It's a good report.
Nice, yes. And folks can request a copy of that by just emailing us info@sibylline.co.uk. Now, let's move on to the big one. Megan, Madagascar. We've seen a big change in the last week over there. And your desk has also released a situation update brief, I believe, on the situation unfolding on the ground there. Let's start kind of at the beginning. What led to these protests? And we'll get to why the president is no longer president.
Hi, Sam. Yeah, we have been extremely busy on the Sub-Saharan Africa desk covering all of the developments in Madagascar. Essentially, what we're seeing at the moment comes about because of a series of protests in late September that were associated with the Gen Z movement. But in the context of Madagascar, they specifically related to routine energy and water cuts that were being implemented by the government across cities in Madagascar. Essentially, the young population of Madagascar was extremely tired of facing 10 or 12-hour electricity cuts overnight and during the daytime, and the rampant insecurity that was breeding in their lives. They then launched a protest movement in the capital, Antananarivo, and also incorporated elements of other protest movements that were denouncing endemic corruption within Madagascar's government. In response to this, the then president Ange Rajwell dissolved the government and dismissed the prime minister, and he asked protesters to give him a year to fix the chronic issues to do with Madagascar's water management and electricity generation infrastructure. However, this did not stop the protests, and what we saw in the first week of October was a real shift in the narrative of the protests, moving away from criticising the government for the chronic shortages of water and electricity into calling explicitly for Rajwell to resign. We then saw on the 11th of October the Army's Personnel and Services Administration Corps, also known as CAPSAT, calling on the armed forces to disobey orders from the government and from the president to crack down on protesters violently and to follow their conscience effectively. This then led to an army mutiny, with Rajwell leaving the country on the 13th of October. He then, via Facebook, attempted to dissolve the National Assembly. However, then the National Assembly voted to impeach Rajwell, and a few minutes later, CAPSAT and a contingent led by the now interim president seized power and announced the suspension of the constitution. So essentially, after a few weeks of protests and a mutiny within the military, we're now looking at a Madagascar that is once again ruled by a military government.
Okay, understood. Now, I want to pause on this moment here, because your report notes, and we spoke offline about how kind of crazy this all is. Let's just start really basically with CAPSAT. So can you just explain a little bit who they are? They're a separate unit within the military. And then a second part to that question, is this unusual? I feel like your report does mention we have seen this before, CAPSAT overthrowing governments. So yeah, who are they, and how unusual is this for them to be involved?
For sure. So CAPSAT is a very elite unit within the Malagasy army. Essentially, they're one of the highest ranking and most competent units, and they have often played a role in periods of political instability in the past. Indeed, in 2009, CAPSAT joined in with an anti-government protest movement that was smaller in scale compared to the protests we're seeing now, but still very, very sizable. That was effectively led by the then mayor of the capital, Antananarivo, and Rajwell. They then overthrew the government and installed him as president, and he remained in power from 2009 until 2014, when we saw a reversion to civilian rule. And the leader of the Capsat regiment this time that has rebelled once again is called Mikhail Ranjajrin. He is an individual who spent 4 months in prison in 2023 and 2024 because of what the authorities at the time called his efforts to orchestrate a coup. This is not a situation that is unprecedented. The military has often played a role in Madagascar's politics and in changing the presidency and the administration at power at any given time. But the fact that we're seeing Capsat again rebelling against an individual which they once put in power speaks to the widespread discontent with Rajwell's administration and the trajectory of Madagascar's development, particularly in the post-COVID era. Essentially, in 2009, we had the president, Marc Ravalomanana, being overthrown by Capsat, who was backing Ange Rajwell. Ange Rajwell was then president for 5 years before stepping down to facilitate a transition to civilian rule. We then saw someone else coming into power. Rajwell was then elected in 2018 and re-elected in 2023, but because of the discontent, we're now seeing Capsat, led by someone that Rajwell himself arrested in 2023, now overthrowing him and putting Ranjajrin, the individual who had been in prison, as the interim president.
Right. So this is kind of almost like a hot potato situation between civilian rule, the military rule that dates back to 2009 with many of the same characters.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. All right. So Capsat claimed that this move would stabilize the capital with all the protests. Now, what's going on the ground now? Have the protests calmed down, or is it ongoing?
We're in the very early days of this. So Capsat, at the time of recording, only assumed power 2 days ago. And so I think it would be unfair to sort of broadly characterize what the trajectory of the protest movement is at this point in time. But in general, we have seen a decrease in the intensity and the size of protests within the capital and in other cities in Madagascar. Essentially, the goal of seeking Rajwell's resignation has been achieved by one means or another. And what we have also seen from the military government is a call for calm, a call for individuals to not engage in further protests because of the critical economic disruption that poses to Madagascar's economy. And our assessment is that the rate and frequency of protest activity and associated unrest in major cities will decrease in the coming weeks because the major obstacle to protest, that being what was seen as an intransigent administration, has now departed. However, the military government is still going to face the fundamental and structural issues that the former government faced when it came to improving infrastructure. Madagascar is an incredibly poor country. That access to international capital and loans is extremely restricted. And so investment in infrastructure that will improve energy security and water security is going to be very hard to come by. It's worth also noting that a lot of Madagascar's electricity is generated by hydroelectric dams, which rely on rainfall to fill up reservoirs. The past few years have seen below average rainfall in Madagascar, and unfortunately the military government does not have increasing rainfall within its powers, and so it's going to continue facing these structural economic issues. And if we don't see an improvement in the electricity situation, in the water access administration, or indeed in purging corruption from the areas in which Gen Z activists identified it as being rampant, then unfortunately we are in a situation in which those protests will likely resume.
That's really interesting. So the length of this transition period is kind of dictated by international aid or the lack thereof and environmental impacts. So fascinating. Thank you, Megan. Finally, I just wanted to quickly ask you if you've seen how maybe this, and we'll get James in on this later, how this situation in Madagascar fits into the wider Gen Z or Gen Z, as I'm realizing I'm pronouncing it wrong, protests across the world.
Absolutely. I think it's very fair to say that the protests in Madagascar do fit in to the trend of Gen Z protests that we've seen emerging in the past few months. Many individuals who attended demonstrations were carrying the Jolly Roger flag and made references to One Piece, just as James noted had occurred in Nepal. So it's certainly part of this trend. It's understandable why that would be the case. About 60% of the population in Madagascar is below the age of 30. So demographically, it certainly fits. And this is not the only example of Gen Z protests that we've seen emerging on the African continent in the past few months and the past few years. We recently produced a What Just Happened podcast on the Gen Z protests that have emerged in Morocco in the past few weeks. We also saw spates of Gen Z-led protests in locations like Kenya in 2024 and earlier this year in 2025. And so when we're seeing the mobilization of young people as part of relatively diffuse protest activity, calling out corruption and calling for an improvement in living standards, then there's certainly a similarity there. However, the way in which these protest movements are going to evolve over time, whether or not they'll be able to effectively capitalize on the movements that brought down certain governments, like in Madagascar, like in Nepal, for example, that remains to be seen. And the effectiveness of their policy programs in addressing the systematic issues that have plagued the economies of many of these countries still remains to be seen.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Megan. So let's bring James back in here and let's just look at this more as a global picture. As we know, there's tons of these happening all over the world. So, James, I just want to start with, is this Gen Z movement becoming more effective, or is it just getting loud?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both. We have certainly seen Gen Z activism become louder over the last couple of months. As Megan mentioned earlier, we have seen protests all across the world, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, that are Gen Z motivated. So there's definitely been what we would term sustained or an uptick in this kind of activism, which is increasing the noise around it. And I think it's actually through process of increasing that noise that the efficacy of these protests has also increased. I think the additional global reporting on it, the media taking an interest in these kind of protests and covering these stories extensively has ended up putting additional pressure on governments and has then led to some of the kind of governmental changes that we've seen in different countries as a sort of indirect byproduct. So I think it's probably a little bit of both. It's definitely seeming to get louder. I think that possibly is through widening social media usage and the availability of social media that is far higher than in previous years across different countries, but also the sort of focus on it in international media, increasing pressure on governance as well.
Thank you, James. As I was reading your report, the first thing that popped into my mind was the Arab Spring back in 2011 that had this combination of dissatisfaction of young folks organizing using social media, Facebook, Twitter, and the eventual overthrowing of government. So I just wanted to ask you both, do you see any similarities or any differences between what's going on now and something like 2011 Arab Spring? And I'll just start with Megan here.
Absolutely. I think there are certainly similarities, particularly when it comes to how protest mobilizers and activists have been getting people onto the streets and sustaining demonstrations in locations where previously we'd maybe seen sporadic protests, but not necessarily these more sustained campaigns that have really disrupted the operational conditions on the ground in a variety of major cities. I think also there is a worrying similarity when it comes to the Arab Spring, which is that many of these protest movements lack a centralized organization structure or a centralized leadership structure. And so once the initial goal of demonstrating frustration or discontent with the government has been expressed, and we possibly see changes in government, such as the fall of various regimes in Madagascar and Nepal, there's not necessarily an individual or an established structure from those protest movements to then assume power and fill that vacuum. And so the risk of destabilization and then a devolution into an even more chaotic situation is extremely high when it comes to many of these protest movements. I think, though, particularly in the context of the movements we've seen on the African continent so far, there is a difference in the contagion effect, which is something that's often cited in academia and in news coverage of protest movements, which is the idea that once you have a protest in one location, it will then spread to other countries. And it's certainly something we saw in the Arab Spring. We saw protests across North Africa, throughout the Middle East, calling for change. And we haven't necessarily seen that so far in that more geographical sense in Africa thus far. Though we did see protests emerging in Madagascar, for example, we haven't seen protests of a similar sort or of a similar sustained nature in places like Algeria or Tunisia. When it comes to sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we also haven't really seen these protests spreading beyond areas whereby they've initially started, so Madagascar or Kenya. That's not to say there isn't a possibility of these movements emerging, but that immediate domino effect that we saw in 2011 appears not to be present here.
James, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things as well, being this use of social media by Gen Z activists that we should really consider is the level of growth and almost reach that social media has experienced in the 14 years since the Arab Spring. Obviously, it was a fundamental tactic that was used by activists during the Arab Spring, used for engagement, for mobilization, for organization. But I think one of the things we've definitely seen in Nepal is kind of creative uses of non-conventional social media, like Discord, as we mentioned earlier. And I think it's something that we should pay attention to, because it's certainly likely to be a sustained trend amongst Gen Z activism that we see an expansion into the social media realm, and it used as almost default tactic that is likely to cause some risk to governments that are targeted, and also increase that engagement net and that proneness to mobilization as well.
Thank you both. James, what lessons are governments, businesses taking from these movements, or what lessons could they take?
Yeah, so I think, as we've seen in Nepal and Peru, the first lesson that governments are taking is that they need to listen to the people and they need to listen to the masses. And that's been represented in Madagascar as well. You know, the idea that people can mobilize so quickly and so extensively really puts the government on the back foot in terms of discourse, and means that they have to pay attention to the more democratic leanings of the people, and almost their position becomes untenable when a high proportion of society and the population tends to criticize them. I think there will be definitely impacts for businesses in high activism areas. You have the kind of obvious underlying infrastructural impacts to businesses. So in areas of Nepal, we've obviously seen quite large destruction. The Nepalese parliament building was burnt to the ground on the 9th of September. We've seen a lot of sort of destructive tactics used in Peru as well, with bricks being thrown at police, slingshots being used. So there are those kind of latent concerns around properties in those high activism areas. But I think another key thing to consider is the underlying thread behind a lot of this Gen Z activism is sentiments that are anti-government. And any business in these high activism areas that can be seen as associated with government does potentially in the short term face threats and risks reputationally, but also physically. They might face boycotts, they might face other sort of associated risks. So it's definitely a lot to be aware of for both governments and businesses in this sort of ongoing trend.
Couple final questions here. I just want to ask you guys, is there anywhere that you think is prone for this sort of thing to spread? Megan, you mentioned the contagion effect. Anywhere that you think this the newest Gen Z protest could pop up?
Yeah, so I can't necessarily speak about specific areas or regions that we expect to see Gen Z activism or mobilization within the short term. But one thing I think we can expect to see is almost a widening of what Gen Z activism can mean, and a convergence between different issues being represented. We already saw in France in September the use of the same Jolly Roger flag applied to a climate-related activist demonstration. So I think it's really likely that in the short to medium term we might see Gen Z activism diversify in scope and actually come to represent more sort of social issue based activist groups and sentiments rather than being directly targeted towards government. And I think that's something that, short of seeing Gen Z activism around anti-government sentiment specifically in areas, that's something that we can expect to see in different regions across the world.
Absolutely agree. And this is something that we follow in our strategic risk register under a slightly different name, which is diffuse anti-government protest activity. While obviously James has spoken about how Gen Z itself will possibly diversify the issues with which it is protesting or mobilizing activists, for example, there's also the possibility of other demographics or other political groupings adopting the tactics of Gen Z when it comes to mobilizing protests and increasing the number of these diffuse, non-leadership-led protests that we're seeing emerging in countries and regions around the world. Locations where individuals have specific gripes with the government regarding living standards, a failure to live up to promises when it comes to improving living standards, or indeed where the contrast between the living conditions of the majority of the population contrasts so starkly to the luxurious lifestyles of individuals associated with political power, whether those individuals are in Nepal, in Kenya, in Madagascar. Those are the locations whereby this type of mobilization will likely become more frequent and therefore more disruptive in the months to come.
Thank you, Megan. And one final question for both of you. Looking at the amazing graphic in the report, it's pretty clear that aside from France, there haven't really been the presence of the Jolly Roger flag or these Gen Z protests in Western governments, the US, Canada, or other European countries. I'm wondering why this seems to be predominantly South America, Africa, or East Asia. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things we cover in our Activism Monthly reports is, as I mentioned, activist groups. And I think there's definitely a trend towards Western nations organising into specific ideological and issue-based groups. You have your sort of set climate groups, you have set social issue groups, you have set anti-corporate greed groups, and these have kind of a centralised identity that don't lend itself so much to, as Megan described earlier, this decentralised Gen Z activism. I think the other thing as well, which is worth noting, is that a lot of the countries that you know in the West do have fairly regimented and set liberal democratic systems whereby there is the capability of the populace to mandate for political change through, I'd say, more easily accessible channels. And it means that there's not necessarily that requirement or need to communicate political discontent by mobilising and actually getting out on the streets and kind of purporting these disruptive tactics. Instead, people can rally their local politicians and engage in sort of that legislative process. So it is something that is possible. We'll see an expansion of, but I think it won't necessarily be applied to government. And I think it's, generally down to the fact that these political systems look very different from the countries that we've seen Gen Z activism happening widely.
To add on to what James has said, often what we've seen, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, when it comes to responding to the diffuse protests that have been mobilised over the past few years, is a plea from leaders for time, at least a year, for example, in the case of Madagascar, to fix the chronic issues to do with energy and water security. And often that is simply not fast enough for the individuals who are attending protests. In contrast to many countries like the UK, Canada, the US, whereby a response from legislators can be slightly more instantaneous in terms of presenting a distinct policy program or a plan for the implementation of reforms. Often what we'll see in many of the countries that have seen Gen Z protests is a much more lax approach to responding to protesters, vague commitments to improvements in the medium to long term. And when we're seeing those types of responses, when we're seeing a failure of governments to respond quickly to the demands of protesters, which often have to be relatively grave to get people out on the street, that's the point at which we really see this initial protest movement turning into something that cannot be contained and can lead to a change in government, just like we saw in Madagascar.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank both James and Megan very much for joining us. Again, you can check out the reporting from both desks by reaching out to us, info@sibylline.co.uk. Please be sure to check out our sister podcast, What Just Happened, where we covered the protests in Morocco, short form, 10 minutes. So please subscribe to that channel as well. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review, subscribe, helps us grow, and we look forward to seeing you next time.